All right, so here we have another sentence from Moreland and Fleischer, Unit 5, Sentence 13. Femina clamans servum e villa discessurum manuit, ut urna cara a mensa removenda esset. The first thing we need to do is look for our finite verbs in this sentence. Moreland and Fleischer introduces in Unit 5 a new part of speech called something called a participle. Participles are verbal adjectives, so they're constructed from verbs and sometimes have the sort of power or the force of a verb, but they modify nouns just like an adjective would. So we may in fact find in this sentence a lot of verbal ideas, but we're looking for something called a finite verb. A verb that is limited or restricted by a personal ending that is governed by a subject. So when we're looking for finite verbs, we notice that there are only two candidates. We have manuit and we have removenda esset. Now, manuit I jumped out simply because it's a verb that we're familiar with. It has a very recognizable personal ending. Removenda esset is another story. Esset is a form of the verb to be. It happens to be the imperfect subjunctive of the verb to be. And this word itself also has a personal ending. It's a third person singular personal ending. But whenever we have the verb to be, I have suggested that you look around and see if there happens to be a participle that may be sort of working together with the verb to be to create a compound verbal idea. And beside esset, we see removenda. And removenda does in fact happen to be a participle that is working with this verb to be. And that's why I underlined both of these words. Now, we're not going to deal with this construction just yet. Suffice it to say that it is a compound verb, it is in the subjunctive, and that is information that is going to be useful when we're trying to determine what clauses we have in this sentence. Manuit, we don't see any information subordinating this verb, but notice that we have ut here right after manuit, and ut often functions with verbs in the subjunctive to create subordinate clauses. Clauses of purpose, result, and indirect commands. So I'm going to go ahead and put ut urna cara a mensa removenda esset between brackets here, just telling me that this is a subordinate idea and one that I don't have to worry about just yet. So let's deal with our main idea. Manuit, if we are working to identify it, manuit has four principal parts, like most verbs will, and we see moneo, monere, moneo, monere, monui, and monitus. This is a second conjugation verb, and manuit happens to be built off the perfect stem. We go to the third principal part of the verb and remove the I, and we get manu. That is the perfect stem onto which we build verbs in the perfect system, which are the perfect tense, the pluperfect tense, and the future perfect tense. Manuit, however, doesn't have a tense ending, era or eri, so it just happens to be in the perfect tense. It has a third-person singular personal ending. This personal ending is active, so third-person singular active. We have determined that this is perfect tense, and it is in fact in the indicative mood. So, third-person singular tells us that this verb is governed by he, she, or it, or a noun in the nominative singular. So let's see if we can find a noun in the nominative singular. First word in the sentence is femina. Femina is a noun. Femina, feminae. That is a first declension noun in the feminine, and the a ending in the first declension is nominative or ablative singular. Since the verb is telling us to expect a subject, a singular subject, I think would be a good guess that femina is working here as the subject of monoid. It is nominative singular. Before we put femina together with the verb, we have to determine whether there is anything else in the sentence that is modifying the subject. Femina is followed by the word clamans, and clamans happens to be verbal. It is constructed from the verb clamo, clamare, clamavi, and clamatus. Clamans itself is constructed from the present stem, which we get by taking the re off the second principal part, or the infinitive, leaving us with clama, and onto that we add ns. Clamans happens to be the present active participle. Clamans, the present active participle, is the only participle that we have that declines in the third declension. If we look at the genitive form of clamans, from which we get the adjectival stem, we see that clamans goes to clamantis, and that's where we get the stem, clamant here. Clamans, however, happens to be the nominative singular for all three genders of nouns, the masculine, feminine, and neuter. You could call clamans a third declension noun of one termination, meaning it just has one ending in the nominative singular for all three genders. So here, in our sentence, femina is nominative singular. Clamans can only be working as a nominative singular, so we are going to understand it also in the feminine gender, and clamans and femina are working together. So we can just kind of put a line here indicating that they are in agreement. Okay, so we have a noun as our subject. We have a participle modifying this this subject, and then the verb. I think we can go ahead and start translating our sentence. So femina means the woman, and clamans is a verb that means to shout. Well, present participles we translate just by taking the verb and adding ing to it. So we could say the shouting woman. This could also be translated the woman shouting something as an active participle. This participle can take its own direct object or introduce its own direct object. But I'm not going to assume that that's the case just yet, because if that were the case, we might expect to have numerous ideas in the accusative. Monoid, our main verb, is a transitive verb, and it will also expect to have a direct object as well. So if we don't have a prevalence of ideas in the accusative, it may in fact be that our present participle, its verbal force anyway, is sort of being limited. It's not introducing any new information into the sentence. So let's go to our verb. Monoid means to advise or to warn, and it's in the perfect tense. So the shouting woman advised. Okay, and we're going to look for a direct object. So let's proceed to identify words in our sentence. May as well stick with red for these arrows here, but here's red number 7. Makes it a little more interesting. Our next word in the sentence is servum. Okay, servum is a noun, comes from servus, servi. That's a second declension noun. It's in the masculine gender, and the um indicates that it is in the accusative case. So this is servus is accusative masculine singular, and the accusative is the case of the direct object. So it's likely that servum is functioning as the direct object of the verb monoid. The shouting woman, or the woman shouting, or however we want to configure that, advised the servant. Now, we have a prepositional phrase here, a villa, but before we get to that, I want to consider discessurum, because that's actually an interesting element in this sentence. Discessurum happens to be verbal, meaning it's constructed from the verb discedo, discedere, discesi, and discesus. It's formed from the verb, but it's not a finite verb. It actually has an adjectival ending. It's formed from the fourth principal part, discesus, that would be our perfect passive participle. But before these adjectival endings, we have the insertion of a ur, discesurus a Well, that is indicative of the future active participle. The future active participle declines in the first and second declension, and we translate it about to do something, whatever the verb means. Discesurum ends with and in the first and second declension, will indicate a masculine or neuter idea in the accusative singular. It could also be neuter nominative singular, but since we have a feminine subject, we can discount that. And in fact, since servum, let's move this information up a little bit and place it a little more accurately. I think that's as good as we're going to get here. Since servum we've identified in the accusative masculine singular, and discesurum can be accusative masculine singular, I think we can go ahead and understand that discesurum is a future active participle modifying the servant. So let's go and translate that. The shouting woman, or the woman shouting, advised the servant. Discesurum means to go away, or to leave, or to depart. So the shouting woman advised the servant about to depart a villa. And here we have our prepositional phrase. A is the preposition that means out of or away from. And villa is our first declension noun in the ablative singular here, simply meaning house. The reason why it's sort of placed between servum and discesurum, these two ideas in agreement, the author is being helpful, telling us that this prepositional idea pertains to the accusative phrase. Okay, so that this prepositional idea is in fact kind of resulting from the verbal idea in the accusative here, that verbal idea being discesurum. So the shouting woman advised the servant about to depart from the house, and then we have our subordinate clause that follows, this ut clause. And as I indicated in our previous sentence, ut, when following a verb of petitioning or ordering or advising, introduces an indirect command. So advise the servant that something should be done. Okay, so, or advise the servant to do something. So let's find out what has to be done here. Let's go to the verb removenda esset. Now, compound verbs frequently intimidate students, but in fact, I find that they're even more helpful than simple verbs, simply because it will give us a lot more information about our subject. The verb to be, esset, is in the imperfect subjunctive, and that's what we would expect with this subordinate clause. The ut clauses, these indirect commands, require verbs to be in the subjunctive mood, and esset happens to be in the imperfect subjunctive. And it's in the imperfect subjunctive as opposed to the present subjunctive according to something called the sequence of tenses. But that's not something that we're going to get into. Let's just assume that the author who wrote this knew, in fact, what he or she was doing. So esset's in the imperfect subjunctive, but the most important information for now is its personal ending. The T here tells us that it is a third person singular active. Well, actually, not active because it's in compound here, but at least that it's third person singular. If we were to look at removenda, the participial component in these compound verbs will tell us, in fact, the gender of the subject that is governing it. Removenda as a participle will modify the subject in the nominative. Okay, so I think it's important for us to figure out, in fact, what type of participle removenda is, and it comes from removeo, removere, removi, and remotus. And removenda is formed from the present stem. The present stem of the verb we get by removing the re from the second principal part, or the infinitive, leaving us with remove. And then we have the addition of ndus, removendus, and removenda, removendum, which provide our first and second declension adjectival ending. So removendusa is a participle declining according to the first and second declension, and it happens to be this form happens to be the form of the future passive participle. When we have the future passive participle functioning in compound with the verb to be, we call this a passive periphrastic. And again, a passive periphrastic is a intimidating description or label, but in fact they are quite easy to deal with. Periphrastic simply is an idea that takes a lot of words to express something that could otherwise be expressed more simply. Here, a future idea that happens to be in the passive voice. One thing with passive periphrastics that we need to be aware of, however, is rather than simply translating them literally, something is about to be done or was about to be done, we need to also understand that they oftentimes have the force of necessity or obligation. So not as something only to be done, it must be done, should be done, or ought to be done. Okay, so that's how we're going to deal with removenda esset, but let's find its subject. We know that the esset tells us that this is third person singular. The removenda has the feminine nominative singular ending, so we know that the subject has to be feminine nominative singular. So that allows us to kind of zero in on our subject with a lot more precision than a simple verb. So let's look at urna here. Urna, our first word in the sentence, comes from urna, urnai. This is a first declension noun in the feminine, and the A gives us our nominative or ablative singular forms. Since we're looking for a feminine nominative singular, and urna does satisfy these requirements, I think it's fair to understand urna as the subject. So nominative feminine singular, it's just right there so we don't forget. Urna is followed by kara. Kara comes from the adjective karus, kara, karum. This is a first and second declension adjective. The A ending can be four different things. It could be feminine nominative singular, feminine ablative singular, neuter nominative plural, and neuter accusative plural. But as a feminine nominative singular, we already have a noun for it to modify. So let's understand kara modifying urna, feminine nominative singular. And so now we have the entire nominative idea and the verb. We can put these together. The woman shouting, or the shouting woman, advised the servant about to depart from the house that the expensive earn. Now let's deal with the passive periphrastic, removenda esset. This shouldn't simply be translated that the expensive earn was about to be removed, because as I said, periphrastic ideas convey a sense of necessity. So we should say that the expensive earn had to be removed. Okay? And that simply now leaves a prepositional phrase to deal with, a mensa. Mensa is a first declension noun from mensa, mensai, and it could be feminine nominative singular, but we already have urna doing that for us. So, and of course we have a preposition, a here, which expects an ablative. So mensa we are going to identify as feminine ablative singular. Now frequently after passive constructions like removenda esset, when we see the preposition a or ab, it's going to introduce something called an ablative of agent. With passive periphrastic, however, the agent, or the actual performer of this verb, will be expressed in the dative. So that's something that we've covered in class. Here, the mensa idea, this prepositional idea, is actually indicating an ablative of place, place from which, in fact. So we could translate this: the woman shouting, or the shouting woman, advised the servant about to depart from the house that the expensive urn had to be removed away from, or simply from, the table. And that's the translation for mensa. So here is a sentence that I think gives us good practice, not only with these intimidating things called periphrastics, but also some future active participles and indirect commands.